Brenda?
Yes.
I think the one thing that I found with my kids as they were going through it was when they used it, it's called a rubric. Is that
Yes.
A rubric?
And because it got away from grades.
Yes.
And I'm not a firm believer in grades at all, because it can rate from one teacher to another, right? It's if the child can learn to understand this is where I'm at, and they decided for themselves that they wanted to be here or here. And that self-regulation that they had to find in themselves to goal set. And it's like goal setting. It's teaching our kids to think about how do they achieve goals.
Right.
Which goes far beyond the school.
Right.
And I've seen it now. My kids were at Princess Anne for years and before it closed, and they were already working in this project. And it's funny, they're now in university. And one was in that program and one was not. And the difference at university is night and day. Because one found school very easy. She figured out very quickly how to do what the teacher wanted and get all the straight A's.
Yes.
The other one had to learn how to do the work, how to figure out how it worked for her. And they used this system, and she decided she wanted to be above average. Like she wanted to be exceeding expectations.
There you go.
Exceeding expectations. I couldn't do that for her. Yeah. Nobody can do that for them but themselves. So by teaching them how to self-regulate and own their own learning, allows them to be successful, I think, in the long term when they are out of our homes and outside.
Yeah, and what I find fascinating about this too is as soon as you begin to own your learning and you know how you learn, you also get into that cycle of a culture of critique. And you can continually say, well, what can I do to be able to get to this next point? And when you start goal setting, you start thinking about, yeah, I can do more. Yeah, I can do more. And then you keep them going back to maybe trying that again, doing it again. And not saying necessarily that you have to, but if you want to, you can continually try to get better. And I've read so many great books about that concept of culture critique. And it's really students that get really energized about taking it to a level that none of us as educators would ever think was possible for that student. It's because they're owning their own learning and thinking, I can do more. Like too often, our students say, well, it's good enough because I got the mark.
Yeah.
Right?
Because that's what they're trying.
And then there's no feedback, right, about what they can do to go another step further. Or there's no opportunity to be able to say, I can now take my learning and add on to that and go somewhere else with it.
Or there's no student voice. I mean, forever, I'm not criticizing again, forever we haven't given students a voice. We haven't. Let's be realistic, we haven't. So that what Bob is talking about, if we give students a voice in their own learning, then you will see them fly versus more of a compliance approach where we have said, this is what you do, this is how you do it, and if you do it exactly this way, you get this grade. Okay? So that may fit for some kids, but for many of our kids, that does not allow they've actually done functional MRIs of the brain and different approaches, and if you are in that kind of approach, you see very little areas lighting up in the brain. If I say, Bob, what do you think? You start to see these areas light up in the brain that weren't lighting up before. How do you think you could do it? They light up again. And what do you think you might do differently next time? They light up again. So asking a student, what do you think, versus saying, Bob, you need to do it this way. So what the different areas of, when I tell Bob, this is what he needs to do, there are little tiny areas that light up. When I say, Bob, what do you think? Then you start to see the areas light up. So that's what we're trying to look at, this optimal cognitive functioning in kids, and really create these critical thinkers for 21st century learning. But we won't create critical thinkers if we're just telling kids what to do. And if we're just teaching them in one way and teaching them in one style.
The one I was going to go to one other point is what I heard the two parents ask about is their role in 21st century learning or in this kind of environment. And personally, going through it, it is really important for parents to understand, one, what it is. That's why I was really encouraged to see you guys hosting this kind of session. You need to understand what it is, and you need to be involved. And that is connecting with your teacher, connecting with your principal, having an understanding of what's working. Because I think part of the problem And openly, I admit even to myself, the problem initially when my daughter was 7 and 8 and we were dealing with some difficult situation was I wanted to solve her problems. And it was a counselor outside of the system who said, you got to quit. You can't solve her problems. That's a parent wanting to solve the child's emotional, educational issues. We have to help her understand what they are and how does she solve the problem. And so if I wasn't engaged in that, I don't believe she would be as well either, because we have to let go. We have to allow them to find that self-regulation and hear them, and still find that, what I always call the middle ground boundary in our home, of I'm still the parent, there's still rules and expectations in our home, but how do you balance that to allow them to find walking okay to do spelling? You know, mine used to do it on the whiteboard. You know, whatever works for them, as long as they're achieving, that's the conversation to focus. But I really do believe parents need to be connected to the educators, and maybe even challenge the educators who are not accepting as you are in that aspect, because I know kids that are
The other
struggling.
big area we need to look at is bringing research on the brain into our classrooms, because that, it's only been in the last 10 years that we are connecting cognitive neuroscience to education. 10 years. That's not a long time to be connecting research on the brain. And I remember sitting in a conference one time when a lady challenged us and said, what is the one part of the body that you deal with the most as an educator? And we all pointed to the brain, and then they asked us what kind of training we'd taken at university on the brain. Woohoo! And so we looked across Canada to see which universities require mandatory training on the brain for educators. And there's not any in Canada at this moment. That when you graduate with a bachelor's degree in education, that you have to take a mandatory course on the brain. So one of my dreams here in Nanaimo would be, I keep pointing to you, Chris, because I think you're going to be a dream maker, is that that we could align ourselves with the university and design a course on the brain for our teachers in education, because it is critical that we know about the brain. Because when you learn about the brain, you see me keeping doing this, and you learn that the brain learns better when it's moving, then we have to look at that in our classrooms. We know that the brain learns better when it's meaningful. So we have to go into classrooms and think, ooh, is this meaningful to our kids? Because if it's not meaningful, uh-oh, that's not in keeping with the research. So we have to look at what the research is telling us about the brain and attach it to our classrooms. And that is another key thing what we're doing in this area of 21st century learning and self-regulation, is we're taking research on the brain and applying it to the classroom. And that is where Dave Hutchinson shines as your superintendent. What does he call himself here? Superintendent. As your leader here. He knows about the brain. First person I've ever worked with as a superintendent that knows about the brain. He knows about the brain, and he knows that he needs to apply that research to classrooms. And so that would be another critical piece of this. So every strategy that I have in my classroom at Seaview, I would have documentation on the brain as to why I did that. And so that's another thing that we need to be doing with our kids, is teaching our kids more about the brain.
I guess that's why I panicked as a parent when they kept telling me to accommodate for the child, compensate. When I'm thinking, shouldn't we take a young 8-year-old brain and remediate it? like it's moldable.
Yes,
it's neuroplasticity.
yes, neuroplasticity. Yes,
I
yes.
stimulate those areas that are not
Yes.
working, right?
Yes.
But who's best to figure this out? And that's not a simple. Again, it's not a simple thing to do. There's many multi-layers to it. And
Yes.
identifying the areas of deficit, right?
And that's another reason why Dave Hutchinson has established these teams, so that you can look at this, what we call transdisciplinary. So you have different disciplines across the board to look at someone like your daughter, to look at that concept of neuroplasticity and see, geez, which areas could be rewiring, which ones should we be adapting, which ones should be compensating, which ones. And so that's a great point that you bring up, that what areas of the brain are we tempted to rewire and what areas are we compensating. And I suggest we do both. that we're always doing both. But all day long, we are adjusting and modifying, and so that is very important point. Very important point.
And I think that for me, I was lucky. Lynn Brown was my student teacher, my sponsor teacher. I was a student teacher in 2008, and so to be totally honest, she opened my eyes to this way of learning, personalized learning for the kids. And so I kind of feel privileged in that my mentor was like, this is the way it is. So I came into the profession with a very open mind, and getting it into the universities is only going to infect it more. You know, so if you go in, if you're in school and you learn, well, this is how you teach, then you go into the system and you teach that way. So it's second nature to me because this is how I was taught when I was a student teacher. I feel very comfortable in the personalized learning. Hats off to Lynn Brown for helping me get there. So it's a process, right? Like, it's just a process, and it got me really excited inside when you said getting it into the ed program at VIU, because that's truly how we'll get there.
I just wanted to add to your point in regard to being parents. Oftentimes when our kids come home and say, so what did you do at school today? What did you do? Right? So underline do versus switching that up, just tweaking it a little bit to say, so what's working for you as a learner in your class today? And they might not be able to answer that, but it's something where you're building their metacognition. And then you might add another thing, especially in high school. These are the 3 questions that I asked my students, and as Brandy's talking about at the end of the year, Wendy can tell you some more about it, but they put on what they call a showcase of learning. That is the expectation of them. And you'll be starting to see more of that coming out with more educators, the more they start to see how this works. And so they have to answer those questions to me in their e-portfolio. And so what worked for me as a learner? What tools and strategies did I tweak or rethink to improve as a learner? And what will I take to my next grade? And there's a couple of videos that I've got of grade 10s and grade 8s talking about that, and maybe I can get them to draw something that you can see, because that's what they have to do at the end of the year. And so for reporting, yes, I did the traditional summative assessment, but as you know, as you're saying, did you get marked on how well you did today? What was your letter grade for the day? Right? That's not realistic in the real world, right? But it is important as a legal documentation and to give some progress. And in addition to understanding tools and strategies, those performance standards, where they are the rubrics, we call them the learning progressions. So if you're not yet meeting, or you're minimally meeting or developing, and you're almost fully meeting, and you're fully meeting, and then you're exceeding, there are descriptors on those performance standards, and they're in all the core academic areas, as well as health and career and so on. So these rubrics are there that have the learning outcomes, and they guide the goal setting, and also the students themselves can be doing their own assessment of their work. So Steve and I could be doing a writing session, or it could be a response to, personal response to a writing. And so we've got the criteria, and of course we always want to look at that 3rd column for fully meeting, because we're going for that. That's where we want to be. If we're pretty knowledgeable in our skills and our vocabulary is pretty well developed, and we've got some analytical skills around that, then we might be pushing ourselves to move into exceeding. Or maybe we're looking here and saying, well, but I'm almost there. And so it gives them guidelines, or like you say, goals that they can achieve, and it's right there. They take that home with them, and they know what it is. And in math, there are rubrics for math as they progress along. So it builds into that metacognition and that ownership. But it does take a while